Thank you, Jesse, and thanks to the SCA for this opportunity to be able to speak to you about something that's it's interesting. I was mentioning to Ezra Hedaya a minute ago that this day is sponsored in memory of Rabbi Labaton, alav shalom, and this class is based on an interest that he piqued a long, long time ago. He gave a speech in the old West Deal synagogue about this prophecy that we're going to talk about today. I didn't understand it at all at the time. I don't even remember most of what he said, but I remember it being interesting and piquing my thoughts about it, and it wasn't until I became an adult that I could fully appreciate the nivu'ah that we're going to look at today and how it changed. So I feel bad that I didn't get to talk to the rabbi about it, but I'm thinking he would like what we have to say and what we need to do today, and I'll explain why as we go along. So the title of the class is an updated reading of an ancient prophecy. And this is something that should be interesting to us because the idea, the prophecy that we have, the nivu'ot that we get, the books that we call the Navi, the Torah, there's a certain understanding that the prophecies are timeless. And what do I mean by that? We know that there were lots of prophets at the time that prophecy was expansive and was going on. Not every nivu'ah that Hashem gave to a human being was recorded and finds its way into the Tanakh. Most don't. So the question is, why do the nivu'ot that are in the Tanakh get to us? So the answer seems to be that there needs to be some timeless nature to the prophecy. Right? It couldn't have been something that was only relevant to that time, but something that's relevant for all time, or most times, or that will have a meaning that will have some understanding in a later time. So the idea that I'm getting at is that prophecy needs to remain relevant, which is very challenging, because prophecies stopped being given in the way that we know about it thousands of years ago. And the world has changed dramatically. And the pace of change in the world has changed dramatically recently. So when we say we're taking a book like the Torah, like the Navi, and a lot of it is geared towards people that lived a long, long time ago, how is it relevant to us? So today is going to be one example of how we do that, and I think actually a radical way of understanding it, which is we're going to see it's the opposite of what it was intended, more or less. And you'll see what I mean as we go along. So what prophecy am I talking about? I'm talking about one of the most famous prophecies of all time, and I will prove that, and one of the most impactful of all time. And that is Yechezkel chapter 37. You should have the sheets. If you have them, great. If not, it's going to be up on the wall behind me anyway. And the prophecy of Yechezkel is very famous because of its imagery. It's known as the vision of the dried bones. And I'd be surprised if you haven't heard of it at some point before. We actually read it once a year as a haftarah. If I'm not mistaken, on Chol HaMoed, Pesach or Sukkot. I think it's Pesach, but is it Sukkot? It's Sukkot. Sukkot. So Pesach is Gog uMagog, right? So it's Chol HaMoed Pesach. Sorry, Sukkot on the Shabbat. So let's look at what it has to say. But before we do, you have to appreciate who was Yechezkel. What time was he prophesying in? So in order to do that, I'm going to throw an image up for thought. Right? Picture you are around when this picture was taken. Right? This picture is taken in 1945. Right? Now, the truth is this was taken upon the liberation, right? But imagine it was 6 weeks before the liberation or 1 year before the liberation. Right? And the question is, what would you say to these people? Right? If you were looking, these people who are living through the Holocaust, right, what words would you have to them? What could you say to them? Is it possible, you who know where we are today, we live in the United States of America, we have the state of Israel, which didn't exist at that time. What could you say to these people? Would you just tell them, you know, it's going to be good one day, right? What do you say? Because this actually was the challenge that Yechezkel faced. Because Yechezkel is a prophet who lives in Bavel for the most part, and he needs to talk to the Jewish people after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, or even as it's happening. And he needs to tell them that, you know, this is not the end, even though it's pretty much the end. They've seen tens of thousands of people die through a variety of different ways. They've seen cities be burnt and destroyed over 100 years. They've seen the Beit HaMikdash completely get wiped out. They've seen infighting, and now they've been taken to a different country where they're basically going to assimilate. He needs to tell them, don't worry, it's going to be good. Right? That's his job. So how do you do such a thing? That's the context that you have to think about as we read this Nevuah. So let's take a look at it. If you have the sheets, great. If not, I'm going to put it up on the board. And there's a few different pieces to it. So I'm going to read off of here, but you can definitely read off the sheets if it makes it easier. And there is a translation, although, of course, I'll translate it. Something that's important to note is that in addition to us reading this at the Chol HaMoed reading as a Haftarah, but we also read it at a variety of different times, including some people read it on Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaShoah, and so on. So it says like this, Hayata, let's see, good. Hayata alai yad Adonai, vayotzieni beruach Adonai, vaynicheni betoch habik'ah. So Hashem's hand was upon me. He took me out with some kind of wind and placed me in the valley, some known valley, although we don't know which valley it is. Vihi mele'a atzamot, and the valley is filled with bones. So what's interesting about a valley, you kind of can get the sense from this room, is that it's sloped, right? And if you're standing here, right, where I'm standing, you see many more chairs than you would be able to see if you were in a flat room like the gym, right? Because of the slope, and the valley is, right, both ways sloped. So actually you can see further, kind of like a stadium type feel. Right? A valley is a natural stadium. So he's able to see bones pretty much as far as the eye could see. V'hevirani alehem, and Hashem, whose hand is on Yechezkel, passes me over them, saviv saviv, kind of like almost like you would do with a drone shot today, taking him around. V'hineh rabot ma'od, there were many bones, al peneh habik'ah, all over the valley. V'hineh yeveshot ma'od, and the bones are very dry. Right, so this is the first part of the image that Yechezkel sees. He sees a valley, and a valley filled with bones that are dried. Now what does that image imply? Right, what's happening? The bodies were there for a long time, right? And if there's a lot of bodies, right, what does that tell you also? Right, it's a battlefield or something, right? Most places, if you find one bone, okay, one guy died there, okay, right? You know, I was watching a show on something, I don't know, one of like Discovery Channel or something, and they found a mass grave of 30 bodies. You know, like 30 is a lot, right? But this sounds like a lot more than 30, right? This sounds like hundreds, if not thousands. Right, so what could cause that? Not clear. We don't know who these bones are, why they're there, but they've been there for a long time, and normally where are bones found, right, they're buried. Right, here the bones are not buried, they're out in the open, also maybe a battle or something like that. Okay, so that's the image that Yechezkel sees. He sees lots and lots of bones. They're dried up, which means they've been there for a very, very, very long time. Okay. Vayomer Elai, Ben Adam, this is the name that we see for Yechezkel in the book of Yechezkel. His name, interestingly, only appears one time in the entire book. In the first pasuk, it says this is the book of Yechezkel, and then never again is his name used. Hashem always calls him Ben Adam. Ben Adam, Hatihyenna ha'atzamot ha'eleh. Hashem turns to Yechezkel after giving him a tour of the valley and says to him, do you think that these bones could come to life? Right? What would you say? What would you say? No, right? I mean, how could that be? Right? But Ba'omar, and Yechezkel says, I know this is a trick question, because it's Hashem asking me. Ba'omar Adonai Elohim ata yadata. Hashem, you know. Right? Meaning, I'm going to put that back on you. What do you think? Right? Which, okay, right, because this is not his first time that he's talking to Hashem, but he doesn't say quickly, right, yeah, of course, right, because of course the answer should be no, but he doesn't want to say no. So what happens? Vayomer Elai hinaveh al ha'atzamot ha'eleh, prophecy regarding these bones, va'amarta alehem, and speak directly to the bones. Ha'atzamot ha'yeveshot, dried bones. Shim'u devar Adonai, hear what Hashem has to say. Ko'amar Adonai Elohim la'atzamot ha'eleh, so says Hashem to these bones, Hine ani mevi bachem ruach v'chayitem, I'm going to put spirit in you and you will live. V'natati alechem gidim, I will place upon you veins, v'aleti alechem basar, or ligaments or something. I will place upon you flesh, v'karamti alechem or, and I will put skin on top of that. V'natati bachem ruach, then I'll place wind upon you, or within you. V'chayitem, and you'll live. V'datem ki ani Adonai, and you will know I am Hashem. So Hashem tells Yechezkel, talk to the bones and tell them, I'm going to make you come back to life. But what's interesting in the way that he says it is he doesn't just say, I'm going to make you come back to life, because the truth is bones can't even come back to life, because bones are so many steps removed from life that you can't even conceive of it, right? Because a bone is like a piece here, there's a piece there, right? So what's going to happen? The bones have to get together and become corpses, right? And then we could bring life into them. By the way, I don't know if you saw this week in the New York Times. They're talking about bringing life back into dead things. They were able to revive, so to speak, a pig. A very interesting type of thing. But okay, anyway, it makes a big question of what is dead and what is life. Anyway, so that's what he says. He says, I want you to talk to the bones, because they're still bones, and tell them Hashem's going to make you alive. Okay? Keeps going. Pasuk 7. V'nibeti kasher tzuveti. So he says, I did what Hashem said. I said exactly what was said in the last pasuk. And guess what happens? Vahi kol kihinavi. When I was prophesying, all of a sudden there was a big loud sound. V'hine ra'ash. Ra'ash, a really loud sound, maybe an earthquake. The ground is rumbling. Vatikrevu atzamot. And the bones start coming together. Remember, bones are nothing. They're not even a skeleton. Etzem el atzmo, bone to bone, so they start connecting to become a skeleton. V'ra'iti b'hine alehem kidim, and then all of a sudden, the ligaments, the muscles, the under pieces of the body start coming and forming. Ubasar Allah, and then flesh on top of that. Vayikram alehem or, and then skin on top of the flesh. Milamala. Right, so they become these bodies. The bones turn into bodies. Veruach en bahem, but there is no life in them, right? So an incredible miracle has happened, right? Which is bones have become corpses, right? Anyone that would see that would say, "Wow, that's pretty amazing," but obviously it's lacking, right? Because they're still corpses, they're still dead. There's not much you could do with them, and there's not so much meaning to it. Vayomer Elai, Hashem turns to Yechezkel again. And he says, Hinabeh el haruach. Now I want you, before you talk to the bones, now I want you to talk to the wind. Hinabeh ben adam v'amartai haruach. Go, prophecy, speak to the wind. Ko'amar Adonai Elohim, say to the wind, Mar baruchot bo yaruach. From four corners of the earth, the wind should come, ufchi b'harugim ha'ele b'yechyu, and breathe into these corpses. Now look at the word, they went from being bones to harugim, right? What does harugim mean? Murdered, right? People that were killed. So we kind of get a sense of who these people are, right? They were there. It could have said metim, it could have said gviot, or corpses. It uses a different term, it uses harugim, but breathe into these murdered people, and they will live. V'hinabeti kasher tzivani. And I prophesied as I was commanded. V'tavo bahem haruach v'yichyu, and the wind came in and they lived. V'yamdu al raglehem, they stood up on their feet, sign of life. Chayil gadol me'od me'od. Chayil, we all know the word chayil. Right? What does chayil mean? Right, like a soldier, a platoon. Gadol me'od me'od, a very large group of people, which maybe leads us to believe that there was some kind of battalion, they were fatalities in a battle, something like that. Well, I didn't see Game of Thrones, so I don't know. But this is a very powerful image, right? And it certainly helped give birth to the idea that we know that's one of the major Jewish beliefs, which is Tchiat HaMetim, the idea that Hashem can and maybe will bring people back to life. But this prophecy is actually not talking about that, although it certainly gives that imagery. This prophecy has a different purpose. Right? The purpose is not for him to perform a miracle. It's for him to see this and then do something with this image. And that's where the last few Pisukim are going to really help us out. Vayomer Elai ben Adam. So now Hashem turns to Yechezkel after this amazing miracle, and he says, or vision, whichever it is, Ha'atzamot ha'ele, these bones, kol bet Yisrael hema. These are all of Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, the house of Israel. Hineh omrim, they're saying, Yaveshu atzmotenu, our bones have dried up. Va'aveda tikvatenu, we've lost all hope. Nigzarnu lanu, Hashem made a gizerah upon us. What's the gizerah? The Beit HaMikdash is destroyed. You're finished. You're gone. Right? So they figure that's the end. Lachen hinavi. Now you have to prophecy to them. Va'amarta lehem, and say to them, Ko amar Adonai Elohim, so says Hashem, Hineh ani fotech et kibrotechem. I am opening your graves. V'ha'aleti etchem mekibrotechem. I'm going to take you out from your graves, Ami. V'heveti etchem, and I will bring you el admat Yisrael, to the land of Israel. V'itatem ki ani Adonai, you'll know it's me, Hashem, b'fitchi et kivrotechem, when I take you out from your graves, u'b'haloti etchem et kivrotechem, and when I lift you up from the graves, Ami, my nation. V'natati ruchi bachem, I'll place my wind within you, v'hayitem, and you'll live, v'hinachti etchem al admatchem, and I'll place you on your land, v'datem ki ani Adonai dibarti v'asiti Adonai, you'll know it was me, Hashem. Right, so an incredibly powerful message, which is, over is not over. Dead is not dead. Right? You think you're dead. You've been exiled, you've been killed, the Beit HaMikdash has been destroyed. You think you're going to be Babylonians now. You're not. This can have a different ending. You could come back to life. Right? That seems to be the message. And that's the message that Hashem gave to Yechezkel. We do know that 70 years later, they did come back, and it did work. However, and certainly this is a good way of reading it, the truth is there are problems with this prophecy fitting that message. Because, as someone said before, right, you had to be dead for a long time. And when Yechezkel spoke to the people, it was actually very, very fresh. They had just been exiled. They were just settling in to the land of Bavel. So to describe them as atzamot yeveshot was very challenging. Also the fact that they're scattered all over, and the four directions of the wind also makes it a little bit challenging to fit into the vision, because they were mostly in Bavel, right? And the ones that came back mostly came from Bavel. So it doesn't exactly fit the prophecy, but nevertheless, it's a very powerful image. It did inspire hope in people, not only then, but actually, as we saw, we read it as a haftarah, it inspired hope for people over generations, right? Meaning, when the longer galut, the second galut, after the second Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, when that happened, that exile was a lot longer than 70 years, and the imagery of dried bones became a lot more relevant, because at that point, within the first 70 years, the hope of coming back, challenging but not impossible. But after 100, 200, 500, 1,000, 1,500 years, the idea that we were dried bones was very, very powerful, right? And so therefore, the imagery really mattered a lot for thousands of years. And this became a prophecy that meant a lot to a lot of different people. And in fact, we see that to some degree, right, this image and this vision came back to life, right? Because what do we have to do? We had dry bones, and we had chayil gadol me'od me'od. We needed to go from nothing, no hope, to big and powerful. One of the things you may have noticed in the prophecy is that it took place in two commands, with two steps. The first command was create the gidim, the basar, the or, create corpses, a physical renewal. But they were still corpses, they were still dead. So Hashem needed to give Yechezkel a second command, and that command was one that was more spiritual, more give them life, bring them back. That's why we have these two. Avda tikvatenu is literally the words that are in the prophecy. Obviously, we know where that ended up, right? And to a certain degree, we're going to see that that's exactly what happened in our world today, right? Look at this, right? Is this a situation of dried bones? Where we stood in 1943, were we in a world of dried bones, of people that had no hope, of people that were scattered all over the place? No question, no question. And what happened? Since that point, we've had a kibbutz galuyot. A kibbutz galuyot means that what happened? The first aliyah, people coming from all over to the land of Israel. And it continued, Soviet Jewry, Ethiopian Jewry, today Nefesh B'Nefesh, American Jewry. The idea of this prophecy, the idea of bringing back dry bones to life, came to fruition. It's something that really, really happened today. Anyone, right, anyone could make aliyah to Israel, right, and it's great, right, it's a fantastic thing. Any one of us could go and make aliyah. Think about where that stood 100 years ago. 100 years ago, when you read the Nevuah that we read today, what did it mean? It meant you could have hope, right? It meant you could believe, right? You could, it doesn't look good, right? If you were living in New York in, say, 1922, right, what were the odds of living in Israel, right? What were the thoughts of Geulah? Like, nonsense. Every once in a while, a guy would come in and collect a few dollars to say, we're planting a tree in Israel, and we're like, okay, yeah, here's 25 cents, but no one really could have thought that. And today we really, look at what we have. Right, and so this prophecy that we talked about, right, like really, it came true, right? This all happened, right? We have, right, all these steps came. We are Hayil Gadol Me'od Me'od, right? And so therefore you say, wow, this prophecy is like we rang the bell, we did it. Except for one thing, right? Did we do this, right, or didn't we? Right? In other words, we did have dried bones, and we do have kibbutz galuyot. But if we remember from the prophecy, right, the prophecy had two steps, not one. Right? The prophecy did have the idea, sorry, 1 second, trying to go back, 1 second. The prophecy did have a physical return to the land, right? But the prophecy also had this other idea that was going to take place in a second stage, which is the ruach, that there's a difference between returning to the land and there being life in the bodies, right? It happened in two stages. So although we're really happy about what we have here today, and we recognize the value of it, right? And we say the words, Od lo avda tikvatenu, that's what we say in the Hatikvah, right? It comes from this Nevuah, right? But we have to think about something, right? We have to think about what is the Hayil Gadol Me'od Me'od, right? Today, when you think of the strengths of Israel, what are the strengths that you think of, right? So certainly, Hayil Gadol Me'od Me'od, you can look at the Israeli military, right? Yesterday, right, what was Israel able to do? They're able to see our enemies planning to launch a missile at us, and they can go find them, attack them, and know that they're going to send missiles back, and we're not really worried about those missiles because we could shoot them down in the middle of the sky. They're as likely to land a missile and kill their own people than to kill us. Right? That's what Israel calculated. It's true. It happened. That is the definition of Hayil Gadol Me'od Me'od. Right? Like we really got to this Hayil Gadol Me'od Me'od. And the truth is, if you think about Israel, right, we're Hayil Gadol Me'od Me'od in a lot of other ways. Right? Israel is known for its military strength. And if you have noticed the Abraham Accords, which we all noticed, right, why are the Arab countries interested in making friends with Israel, quote, all of a sudden? It's because of this, because they saw, you know what? they have fighter planes, and they have tanks, and they have great security, and they have great espionage. We're better off being friends with them than being friends with some of our own, quote, friends. And so that's why Israel is known for this. But is that all Israel is known for? What else is Israel known for? Technology, right? Medicine, right? And lots of other things. Israel is known for some really, really great stuff, right? And in some ways, Israel is like ahead of where America or certainly a lot of other countries are. So certainly we have a certain degree of Chayil Gadol Me'od Me'od. Yeah. Oh, you're going to say, I look like you're going to say something. However, I want to go back to this idea and say, we have to read the Nevuah a little bit more carefully and say, something's missing, right? Because although we have the Holocaust leading into the modern day state of Israel, there's something else that's missing, right? There's this Yidi'at Hashem that Hashem talks about, and the Nevuah, what does that mean? So something's missing. So I want to quote Rabbi Sachs. Rabbi Sachs, in a book called Future Tense, written a little over 10 years ago, said, the first challenge of Zionism, the creation of a Jewish state, has been brilliantly achieved. Right? We have a Jewish state. What does a Jewish state do? Right? We have a land, we have a military, we have a government, we collect taxes, we have rules, it's there, right? What's amazing is Israel is not yet 75 years old, right? It's going to be this year. Are any of us really worried about Israel making it to 100 years old? Right? We're not. Right? We're not worried. Right? I mean, we should be a little bit worried, but we're in an amazing place just 75 years into a country. We're better off 75 years in than America was 75 years when it started. Right? We're just in a much better place. But the second challenge, right? Notice how he says there's a second challenge. He wasn't talking about this Nevuah. He says, but the second challenge, the challenge of the creation of a Jewish society, has hardly been tackled at all. And what his point is to say is that we have a state that is particularly Jewish, but is our society Jewish? And what makes a Jewish society? Right? Meaning, is the country Israel known for things that are Jewish? Right? What makes it Jewish? Is it a Jewish society, or is it just a state? There's a lot of Jewish people, and by the way, a lot of not Jewish people. Right? What makes Israel Jewish? Is it that? And what Rabbi Sachs wants to point out, he has a couple different things, right? This goes back to just to emphasize this, a very famous moment in Jewish history when Ben Gurion, on an early Friday afternoon or late Friday afternoon, declared the state of Israel. There was a big debate amongst the people as to whether or not the Declaration of Independence would include God. Right? Our Declaration of Independence, the United States Declaration of Independence, includes it very prominently. The United States is very religiously oriented, even though there's a separation of church and state. In Israel, there was a big debate. If you read the Declaration of Independence, you will notice that there is absolutely zero mention of God. None. They had one compromise at the end, right? At the very, very end of the document, not even in the beginning, right? They say, Mitoch bitachon b'tzur Yisrael, placing trust in the rock of Israel, we affix our signatures to the proclamation of this session. Right? And basically the religious people were able to say, what's Sur Yisrael? It's a biblical reference to Hashem. And what did the non-religious people think, of which there were many more of them? It's our strength, it's our army, they kept God out of it. Right? And Israel, at least in its founding, was very anti-religious, anti-Jewish even. And Rabbi Sachs says that this is not something that has completely gone away, even though today there are plenty of religious parties in the government, and that there's a tremendous amount of Torah learning, and Judaism has had a revival because of the state of Israel, and so on. And we, of course, recognize all of that, and we're proudly Zionistic. Right? He says something very interesting. He says, we sustained the Jewish people through thousands of years without a state. How did we do that? What was it that made the Jewish people get through 2,000 years without the state? The Zionists basically said, If you read their history, it's like there was the Bet HaMikdash, we wandered around for a couple thousand years, and then we reestablished the state. But wait a second, a lot of good things happened in those 2,000 years, despite us not having a state. How did that happen? Right? It was built on something that we here know very, very well, right? And maybe that the SCA is very proud of, right? Is the concept of community, right? And community, which we have here, right? Which has zero funding from the state for the most part, right? Has no connection to the state. It has a full separation from the state. And yet, it's incredibly powerful. It's incredibly influential. And the question is, in Israel, do they have what we have here on the scale that they need to have it, right? Our community, when you talk about the Syrian community outside of us, right? What do people say about the Syrian community? They say a few things, some of them good, some of them not, right? And so let's skip over the not for a second. What's the number one positive thing that they say about our community? We stick together, we give tzedakah, right? These are big things. Do they say that about Israel? Right? Do they say about Israel that it's a cohesive society? Do they say that it's a society that takes care of their own, that gives tzedakah? Not as much as we'd like. Israel's not known for that as well as it's known for the high tech. And I'm not saying that it's not true, it doesn't happen. We just haven't achieved that knowledge. We haven't gotten that out there because Israel was created as a state. And the state is very, very powerful. And the way the whole Israel works is around the state. Who are the influential and important people in Israel? The politicians. But are there people building communities in Israel? Do we know about those communities? Are those happening? How does that happen? So Rabbi Sachs would tell you that's missing. There's something missing in Israel, which is creating our society as a society of justice. I was reading yesterday, maybe you read it, in the New York Times magazine about it doesn't matter, it's about a documentary, but they cited a poll, which I didn't have a chance to look up, that 51% of Israelis believe that the court system in Israel is corrupt. Right? 51% believe that the court system is corrupt. I want to compare that to Baghdad. Right? In Baghdad, about 150 years ago, the local Arabs would go to Jewish courts because they knew there they could get a fair shake. They knew there it was honest, meaning two Arabs, when they had a debate with one another, would go to a Jewish court instead of coming to their own court system because they knew it was corrupt. Yet today in Israel, 51% of Americans say, 51% of Israelis say the system is not right. The system is not fair. The system is not honest. So I don't want to make too much out of one poll, but what I do want to say is that we want to try and get Israel to a place where there's a sense where the Jewish values of tzedek, mishpat, chesed are defining characteristics of the Jewish state. That's what, and the Jewish society. That's what Hashem really wanted, and maybe that's stage 2 of what needs to happen. Right? In other words, we had the dried bones. We were Holocaust. We needed to establish a land. We needed to establish a state. Baruch Hashem, we did it. We're going to have the 75th birthday this year. We could sit and we could say, we rang the bell. We have a state, and we have a state that's really strong, powerful, recognized. Our enemies aren't even our enemies anymore. Right? Fantastic. Now, what's the next challenge? Right? Now, talk to what Rabbi Sachs said, which is, now, can we create Israel as a place that's a society built on the values of the Torah and the mitzvot? That all of Israel is that way. That's the next challenge. And if that's true, so we could read the Nivu'ah that we read as a Nivu'ah that for many, many years, for thousands of years, spoke to people who needed hope. It spoke to people who couldn't believe that there was going to be a future for the Jewish people. That's what it accomplished for thousands of years. But today, we have to update the way that we read the prophecy. Today, we have to realize that the prophecy is only what I'll call halfway done, right? Which is that we have the corpses, we have the body, but we need to create the Ruach. We have to create within the state of Israel, not just the state as being the ultimate, but also creating a Jewish society as much as possible. I don't want to say it doesn't exist. I think there's a lot of good things that exist in Israel. But can we get it to the point where people recognize Israel for being this Jewish society? And when I say Jewish society, I mean not a society not a society that is comprised primarily of Jews, but rather a society that is built on the values of Judaism, on the values of tzedek, mishpat, chesed, rachamim, and so on. The ideas that we view people as tzelem Elohim and so on. Are we better than some other countries? Most definitely. Are we a terrible place? We are not. But at the same time, our strengths right now are strengths that belong to a state. Can we get to a place where we can create the strengths of a society? The way that people talk about our community for positive things, can we get Israel to be spoken about as a place where differences are resolved peaceably, where people take care of one another, where the society is one in which charity is a defining characteristic? That's a goal that we have. When we think about what Hashem wanted when he showed Yechezkel that prophecy, he showed him everything. He wanted to see the end. And the end is not simply halfway, and certainly not simply a physical strength, but rather it was something that had a ruchniyut as well, a spirituality as well, and I think that that's something that we aim for. Rabbi Sachs, in the article, if you're interested, he lays out 3 steps that he thinks Israel needs to take in order to be able to do this. The first, he says, is to fix our national narrative. As I mentioned before, Israel, every country, every nation needs a story. And the Zionistic narrative kind of skipped over the 2,000 years of the Jewish people while they were in exile. It kind of just looks at it as like, not much happened during that time. And what he wants to say is that some kind of national narrative which values how the Jews established themselves, maintained themselves, grew to a tremendously successful people during that time is something that's necessary. He also talks about the idea of separation between church and state and how damaging that is to Israel, and that today the religious Jews got into the politics, and he feels that we should follow the model of America where religion and politics remain separate, because he wants religion to be something that's what he calls influential instead of powerful. And he feels that when we get involved in politics, when we get involved in how much money we get, how many votes we get, it becomes much more difficult for people to appreciate the values that are there. Anyway, we'll stop here for now, and I wish everyone a l'rot v'nechemat Zion. Bezrat Hashem, next year we'll be back in Yerushalayim, which, again, we could all go to, but the Yerushalayim of the type that we're talking about, which is a Yerushalayim which is known, right, as it says in our Nevuah that we read yesterday, Tzion b'mishpat tipadeh. Tzion will be redeemed with justice, with righteousness. That's what Hashem looks for.